Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar. We are going to cover 3 different ways of beginning to match your courses to regional job growth and regional skills needs. Here's what we're going to cover in the next 15 to 20 minutes. So for those of you on today's webinar who aren't familiar with NZ, our mission is a simple one. We have a lot of very good detailed data and intelligence on local, regional and national labour markets. And what we want to do is to get that data into the hands of people like yourselves who can use it to make better, more informed decisions. Education remains our biggest market globally, and we have a lot of experience of deploying that strong data and that strong economic intelligence into various different educational institutions and various different processes within those educational institutions. One of the things that we do know is that there is often lots of different data available and lots of different data provided to you. For example, various government data sets, various data sets within the vocational training environment, and lots of those are really good. So we use those, but what we do is we bring all of those different data sets together, we add our own value, and we provide things in a very holistic, joined up manner, again, to help you do the job you're trying to do. So why is this issue a really important one? Why is it becoming more and more important to ensure your courses are planned and delivered based on what your local economy needs? Well, there are lots of answers to that question, but just 3 things that have been floating around that I think are important. Various government policies and priorities and directions from the political parties, both in power and in opposition. The ongoing debate about jobs right now and jobs in the future, for example, around automation, and an external perception and reputation of vocational training, TAFE being included in that, and therefore the need for TAFE to really be able to articulate and ensure that the courses that you guys are delivering are meeting the needs of both your local industry and your local communities. So just some of those government announcements that I mentioned. We all know in the state of Victoria there's been a recent announcement about certain courses being free from 2019. More recently in New South Wales, we've seen the announcement from New South Wales government there around scrapping fees for a number of apprentices. So it's certainly on the radar of the politicians, which we all know, and therefore it's important for TAFE to really get to grips with the issue of what's needed, not just what's being offered for free. So with that in mind, we can see the kind of dilemma that we're all trying to solve here. So we have education providers such as yourselves, then we have the employer and industry and individuals who are receiving that training. And what we need to make sure is that the communication flow between those 2 parties is strong and is based on evidence. So in an ideal world, what we have is a great understanding of growth industries, a great understanding of occupations within those growth industries in your region, a clear articulation of employer demand and what those guys need from you. That then feeds through into course development, course design, and course offering coming out of you guys at TAFE. Those courses are very nicely linked to those careers that employers, industries, and individuals want and need. And if that all works successfully, we have employers getting the skills that they need to be ever more productive. We have learners and individuals who become more productive, earn more, and reach their career goal. And then we have local, regional, and national economies that flourish, which is what everyone wants, and certainly is what us at EMSI want to be supporting through the provision of our strong data. So, how do we start to do that? Well, here are some key questions that should always be at the forefront of your mind when you're thinking about the labour market and you're thinking about how labour market data applies to the work that you're doing. In particular, today we're going to focus on 3 issues: how to understand industry differences, how they are trending, and how that links into occupations, individual jobs, which most closely link to the courses that you guys provide. So before we kind of jump into considering courses, and I guess one of the issues with lots of those government announcements that I touched on earlier on, which jump straight into a number of courses being offered for free, is that we first of all need to think about what's going on in the industry or the industries in your particular region. And why that is important is that it can really give us the full picture, the full jigsaw puzzle and all of the pieces of that jigsaw puzzle, rather than focusing on high-level trends. It gives us a better picture of how our regional economy is made up. So how is that different to what's going on at a state level and of course at a national level? And how is that changing going forward? What are the key industry employer drivers behind that? And once we have that greater understanding of industry and industry drivers, we can then get a better feeling of the jobs, the occupations within those industries, and how our offering is made up. So an example of why this is important: if we consider the biggest growing industries from a jobs perspective, at this stage we're going to look at Australia. If we think of the highest level industry classification, so the industry that is going to have the biggest job growth up to 20, unsurprisingly, that's healthcare. It's always in the news. We always hear about demand for doctors and nurses and carers, so you're probably not surprised to see that. But again, if we think about Australia and we start digging into the detail, if we look at 3 digits of industrial classification over the same time period, we see the fastest growing industries are there on screen: cafes and restaurants, architecture and engineering, and schools. So none of those detailed industries fall into healthcare. So this is a really nice illustration of why understanding the more granular side of industry drivers and industry trending is important. So one of those we saw there is architecture and engineering. But within that industry, what are the jobs? Well, we see here in the left-hand column the jobs that are in this industry. Lots of these are very typical that you would see in architecture and engineering, but I've just highlighted 3 that I think are really interesting. First of all, graphic and web designers. There's a lot of them, just under 30,000, sorry, just over 20,000, and there's decent growth in the next few years. Not necessarily a job you would automatically associate with architecture and engineering as a sector. That's why it's important, I think, to understand this level of detail. Then right at the bottom there, interior designers. Likewise, not necessarily an occupation that would immediately spring to mind if you were talking about engineering, but one that's important and one that would require a very different set of training to those more traditional engineering occupations that we see elsewhere in this table. And then finally, second from the bottom there, engineering managers. So obviously an engineering specific job, but a manager within that sector is going to need a very different skill set and therefore a very different set of training to that of a general engineering professional or an electrical engineer, for example. So is your management portfolio, your management courses set up with any understanding of what engineering needs from its managers? This is why it's really useful to know what sits below the high level industry data to really get to grips with what's going on. If we move on to start those considerations about courses, here are some key questions that, again, should always be at the forefront of your mind when you're thinking about how labour market data can help you with your course development. As we mentioned there, once we start digging into industry data, we can see occupational information coming through that can be really helpful to us. And we can start to think about how our existing courses, or maybe our planned courses, are matching that industry need. We can start to think about where we might have new areas of development, something we don't already deliver. And we can start to think about which specific jobs are trending in your regional economy by getting right down into the detail rather than relying on high level national data only. So an example of that, here we have the top 5 fastest growing jobs in Australia over the next couple of years. You see those 5 jobs there, they're all trending at about 20% growth. Just take a look at the jobs along the bottom there, those 5 jobs. We now look at the same data for the state of Queensland, same time period. Again, top 5 fastest growing jobs, all around 20% growth over the next couple of years, which is pretty huge. Again, just look at those 5 jobs along the bottom there. And finally, the same data for a city. This time we're going to look at Melbourne. Same time period. Again, 5 fastest growing jobs, all growing at about 20% over the next couple of years, which again is pretty huge growth. And just look at those 5 jobs along the bottom. And I'm just going to flick back through the previous 2 slides. Just concentrate on the jobs at the bottom there. What I'm hoping that you're picking up here is there's a lot of difference. So the fastest growing jobs in Australia are very different to the fastest growing jobs in Queensland and are very different to the fastest growing jobs in Melbourne. This is why it's really important to understand the differences between national, regional and local economies. And this is exactly where MZ data is strong and where we can get it into your hands to start understanding these differences. You have your courses that you offer, you have labour market data that we've talked about, And also you have student data, so how many students were doing various courses in the last year. When we start to bring those three data, we understand occupational data that we previously just touched on. We then bring in your course information, your list of courses right now, potentially a list of courses that you're considering of introducing. And then we can bring in your student numbers. So how many students have you previously had on certain courses, and how does that then match up with what the local labour market needs? Which courses are potentially oversupplying the labour market, and which areas of labour market demand from an industry and an occupational level aren't being met right now. Here's an example of a piece of analysis we did for a vocational provider earlier this year. Here we see course areas, so they wanted us to look at 10 particular departments. They then provided us with a number of students completing on each of those departments in the last year. We then brought in MZ data to look at annual openings each year for each of those course areas. So we mapped the course areas and their individual courses in those areas to the relevant industries and occupations in this particular regional economy. We then looked at the amount of openings that were on offer in those occupations each year, again within that same regional economy where this provider is based. So annual openings is new jobs plus the replacement of existing jobs through things like retirement, promotion, churn, etc. So I've just highlighted 3 of their course areas, their course departments here, just to give an example of, firstly, the potential undersupply to this particular local economy. So we see their marketing and sales had a decent number of students, but the demand for jobs is pretty huge in this area. So there's potential for growth there. We can see with wholesaling, they don't offer any courses in that area, but again, there's a pretty decent annual demand for workers in that industry and in the occupations within that industry, and it's something that this particular provider is considering. And then finally, as we see at the bottom there, sport and fitness. It is a growing job. You might remember on those previous slides, fitness instructors were one of the growing occupations in Australia. But for this particular TAFE, we see alarm bells ringing there from an oversupply point of view. So they have lots of people doing those courses, but actually the job demand locally isn't massively high. So this is just a simplistic example of the very detailed work that we can help you guys with. So to wrap things up, hopefully we've started some thoughts in your heads around some of the key questions to consider when you're considering labour market data in your courses. Firstly being, start from industry data, because taking a deep dive into industries can really tell us some important things about what sits under that higher level data. Secondly, why using local data is crucial, because jobs will be trending very differently across different geographies. And then thirdly, how we can start to bring together those data sets. So industry as a starting point, then occupational job data to give us the real detail of what's happening in your area from an occupational point of view. And then we can start to pull in your course information to really get to grips with how you're offering at your institution is at right now, and maybe where it needs us to be in the future. So what happens next? Well, we actually produced a more detailed 3-step guide, which covers in more detail some of the topics and themes that I've touched on in today's webinar. So we'll be sending you that free of charge, and please feel free to share that with colleagues. But what I'd really like to do is to chat with you individually about the issues that you see in your institute and in your region, and we can think about how MZ Data may be able to help you with that, because we have lots of different ways of deploying our data and lots of different ways of working with you to make sure that it's helping you make better, more informed decisions, which, as I mentioned in introduction, is what we're all about. So I hope today has been useful. Again, I hope it's started some thoughts floating around as to how you might be able to use labour market data to improve your planning and your operations. And I really do hope we can speak individually about how we might be able to work together. In the meantime, thanks very much for your time. Thanks for signing up to the webinar and for listening.